pleasure to rise on this first day of Veterans Week to speak to a motion that's exactly about trying to do more for Canada's veterans and trying to ensure that they get the services that they need when they need them. Of course, that's something that we want to see done all year long, not just around Remembrance Day, but I think one of the important elements of Remembrance Day is that it's an occasion for us to reflect on the horrors of war and the sacrifice of war, and to try as best we can, for those of us who haven't participated, to understand what goes into that, to renew our commitment to making peace in the world and building peace in the world, and also renew our commitment to helping those who have been in conflict zones come back and whose lives are being affected, and whose family members' lives are being affected by that experience and the fallout from that experience. So I think that's why it's a very timely motion, not because it has to do with services that it's just important to talk about and deliver around this time of year. It's important all year long. But this is a time of year where we reflect and renew our commitment to doing better. I'm very proud to come from Northeast Winnipeg, where there's a strong tradition of remembrance at our three legions, the Transcona, branch number 7, which is my home legion, the Elmwood Legion, branch number 9, and the Prince Edward Legion, branch 81. And beyond the traditional remembering that's gone on in Northeast Winnipeg lately, we've also been participating very heavily, thanks to the leadership of some members in our community, like George McCall with the Elmwood Legion and Peter Martin and the Transcona Legion, in organizing No Stone Left Alone ceremonies, which are ceremonies that bring school-age children to our cemeteries, where veterans are buried, to lay poppies at the gravesite, and to try and establish a connection between our youth and that memory, because as generations pass from the Great Wars, that connection gets harder and harder to maintain, which is why we need to double down our efforts and remember just how horrible it gets for young people, to be sure, and for all of us when we get involved in very large conflicts such as the First and Second World War. So there's some great work going on in Northeast Winnipeg to that effect. I think it helps to just set some of the context for today's motion. If we recall back to the last Parliament and the last government, the government's relationship to veterans was seriously strained under the last government. I think we all remember the incident of the Minister of Veteran Affairs insulting a group of veterans who had come to meet with him and essentially kicking them out of his office. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, that was just a sign of disrespect. But when it came to policy, it was a government that was closing offices, letting staff go, had decided to take on veterans in court, so had challenged, where Equitas was saying that there is a special covenant between the government and its veterans. The government of the day decided to take the position that no, in fact, that wasn't the case, and spend a lot of money fighting them in court. And of course, we also heard about $1.1 billion in lapsed funding over the tenure of that government. So it was a campaign issue. It was a campaign issue in a way that I think it's fair to say veterans issues hadn't been before, not because it hadn't been discussed, but veterans groups themselves were politically mobilized in a way that the veteran community traditionally had not, in part because they felt so mistreated by that particular government. And so we saw the Liberals on the campaign trail take up the issue. We heard the Prime Minister, for instance, with respect to the lapsed funding of the previous government, say on the campaign trail, they left unspent, and I'm quoting, Madam Speaker, they left unspent more than $1 billion Parliament allocated for veteran support. Canadians know that is wrong. That was something that the Prime Minister said at the time when he was running for the job. He also said in the Liberal platform document, quote, "Our plan will ensure that no veteran has to fight the government for the support and compensation they have earned," referring to the Equitas lawsuit. That's on page 49 of their platform, a memory perhaps some Liberals in this House have suppressed because it's accompanied by a photo of the member for Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill. But I want to say that the Liberals in government have been quite different than the Liberals on the campaign trail. They themselves, despite the Prime Minister saying that lapse funding was something that was wrong and that needed to be addressed and that the department needed to work to ensure that that money got spent properly, have already lapsed in just 3 years $372 million. They're failing to meet 12 out of 24 self-identified service targets. So for instance, only 43% of veterans who apply for disability benefits are hearing back within 16 weeks, Madam Speaker. Only 56% of veterans who apply for the earnings loss benefit hear back within the 4 weeks that's been set as a reasonable target. 45% of veterans applying for the long-term care program are hearing back within 10 weeks, and the rest hear back within more. And of course, we also know, Madam Speaker, that this government, far from terminating the court battle against veterans, decided to keep it up after what was a very explicit promise to drop that. That's what that quote in the platform was about, that veterans shouldn't have to fight the government to receive their benefits. But alas, here we are. That lawsuit continues, and veterans are continuing to have to fight the government in court. So what we're making today is I think, quite a modest proposal to try and say we know that veterans aren't being served in the way that I think we would all like them to be served, everybody in this House and in Canada. So we're trying to be constructive. We're trying to find a solution to enhance that service. And we know, because of the $1.1 billion that lapsed under the Conservatives, because of the $327 million that's lapsed so far under the Liberals, that there is reliably more money to spend within the existing Veteran Affairs envelope, and we should be doing a better job of making sure that that money gets spent for the purposes that it was intended, which is to serve veterans better. We know that when veterans are calling in to get information about how to apply for their benefits, and they're having to wait hours on the phone, it's because there aren't enough people to answer the phone. And the answer to that is to hire and train more people to do that work. That's not a great mystery. I certainly hope it's not a great mystery to anybody in the House. And if the question is, well, where does the money come from? How do we just find money to do this when we know that in the last 2 years, over $140 million has lapsed? You can hire a lot of people to answer a phone, to listen compassionately, and then provide good advice on what those veterans need to do and where they need to go in order to be able to access those services. So when year after year you see tens of millions of dollars being unspent, that's not a quibble about accounting practices. That's what we've heard from the government today, is that, oh, well, this is just the NDP. I mean, I thank them for their respect for our knowledge of good accounting, but I want them to know that this isn't just our excellent accounting skills. It's not just a little quibble about how we label things. This is about the fact that there are not enough people to answer the phone to give the right advice to veterans who need to access services, and we have the money to be able to hire those people and train them so that they can do that work, because we know that each year tens of millions of dollars are going unspent. And so my colleague from Courtenay Alberni has quite rightly said, wow, if we know that money isn't going to be accessed, if we know those services aren't going to be accessed, and we've got a long track record now of knowing that that money isn't spent, then let's use it to hire staff to enable veterans to better access those services. That just makes sense. So it's been interesting to hear the debate today, and it seems to be that we're coming to a consensus that this is something that everybody's going to support. I'm very glad to hear it, because it makes a lot of sense. So let's do this. Let's move forward. Let's try and minimize some of the cheap shots that have been going on today, because this is a common sense idea. We know we can do better for Canada's veterans, and it's time we started doing it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Earlier on, I asked the question of a different NDP colleague why it was, and I do not for a second question that the NDP is extremely worried and feeling compassionate about the role that we play as parliamentarians in delivering for our veterans. But I did ask the question earlier about why it was that the NDP voted against the Budget Implementation Act, which had in it the lifetime pension for vets. And the response that I got was, well, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the budget, and we didn't, so we had to vote against it because there's all this other stuff in it. So my question to the honourable member is the same. Why was it that the NDP voted against that Budget Implementation Act? And if his answer is the same as his previous colleague, can he at least reference a time when he stood up in the House or made it publicly known that he was going to vote against it but was displeased with this particular fact that he couldn't vote separately against this particular item in the budget?
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I would encourage the member to pay more attention to the proceedings of the House, because I think if he did, what he would realize is that the NDP has been up on its feet raising points of order, trying to divide sections of these large omnibus budget bills into separate votes for exactly that purpose. And it's why we don't believe in omnibus legislation in the first place. It's why we were disappointed when the Liberals, who in the last Parliament said they didn't believe in omnibus legislation, decided to use it as a tool in this Parliament. And it's why we're going to continue getting up on our feet, demanding separate votes, and beyond separate votes, Madam Speaker, on different provisions within budget implementation acts. We want them divided so that we can actually have the appropriate amount of time to study those initiatives, study them in detail in the appropriate place at committee, and then have a separate vote on them. So yeah, I'm on my feet now. I've been on my feet before. We've been on our feet many times and will continue to have those separate votes. I encourage the member to support us in that endeavour.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député Salibert-Surroy.
The honourable member. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his speech and for the debate which occurred in the House today to make sure that the amounts involved, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, which are still in Veterans Affairs coffers, when in fact Legion 146 in Beauharnois, when they say they call Veterans Affairs, it takes forever. You're waiting forever on the phone, and it takes so long just to ask a question. We know that for the last 3 years, $372 million were left in the coffers of Veterans Affairs Canada. Why not hire hundreds of employees to provide service to veterans who deserve these services? We need to spend that money. Conservatives cut 1,000 positions, and the Liberals have said they've hired 475. Well, more than half of the positions cut need to be filled, and we need to fill those positions so we can provide services to those who have put their lives on the line to fight for Canada.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for the question. I believe that what I'm hearing, or rather one thing I hear once in a while from my constituents, is that when we engage in parliamentary debate, once in a while, or whether sometimes it can get confusing because we're talking about varying amounts of money, $4 billion here, hundreds of millions there, but the point of our motion today is quite straightforward. When veterans place a call to get the service they are entitled to, well, there's no one at the other end to answer their questions. And we know that from year to year, a lot of money stays in government coffers. So all we're asking for is that that money be actually spent in a way to answer the questions of veterans when they place a call to Veterans Affairs, that we hire people to listen and to give advice. Thank you. Resuming debate.
The Minister